we're blessed to have Merrick here because his wife just gave birth to the first daughter a month ago, and so he's getting very little sleep. In Chris's case, he gets very little sleep because he is constantly traveling around the world, most recently to the Middle East. He just came back on Wednesday from Iraqi Kurdistan. He celebrated Easter in Iraq and has extensive relationships over there that we're going to hear about. Chris has a rather unique background. He was a Marine officer. As they say, once a Marine, always a Marine. He also is an educated Marine. He has a PhD from Fletcher in international relations. He wrote on Uzbekistan, which not very many people do, so he has some interesting expertise. Chris is the President of Emeritus for the Institute for Global Engagement. You'll see that moniker back here. That was begun by his parents. His father was the first ambassador at large for religious freedom issues after Congress passed that law establishing the position back in late '98. Chris has been involved in religious freedom issues for a long, long time. So without further ado, Chris, please come up.
Okay, good afternoon. And I probably blew this already, turning this on. Okay. Okay. Thank you again for having me. And I should note that my wife is here with me, Alyssa. We have 5 children, age 9 and under. So the real reason I travel is to get sleep, which is needed sometimes. I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful for Paul's vision in making this happen, and to the Episcopal Church in Upperville and to the Hill School. We live over in Fauquier County, so we're local yokels. We're townies almost. Not Middleburg townies, mind you, but over in Warrenton. And we've never been here before. What a lovely, lovely spot, and what a beautiful place to be among friends, where we can be candid and not politically correct and all those kinds of things, which of course is the heartbeat of a healthy democracy. So what I'm going to do today, Paul asked me to talk about religion and statecraft. I think that's in the actual blurb. What has our government been doing or trying to, how do we think about religion? And then secondly, share a little bit about how we have been engaging in the Middle East in response to the ISIS crisis. And in many ways, what you're going to hear is a little bit about Providence, because I believe strongly, to say Mark's comments, opening comments a little bit differently, that we're called to steward our citizenships in this world. I happen to be a Christian who happens to be American, but for the Christian, there's a kingdom citizenship, and then there's a national citizenship, and then there's a global citizenship. And I'm not just making that up because I'm a shallow evangelical, but I think it's based in Scripture, in the Pauline example of Paul, who was a Hebrew of Hebrews, Philippians 2 and 3, but also a Roman citizen. He was Romanus Sum. This is probably one of the few places they still teach Latin. But I am a Roman citizen. I appeal to Caesar. And he used those two citizenships pursuant to his kingdom citizenship, which is, how do I testify to the hope within? How do I do that? How do I think about that? And so there can't be in conflict, but the first two citizenships, the national and the global, the Hebrew and the Roman, the American and the global, they must serve a kingdom citizenship, and that is a call to be an ambassador of reconciliation. So what you're going to hear this morning or this afternoon from me a little bit is, what does that mean? How do I live out my faith in a fallen world? In a fallen world where the pessimist has all the facts. Because everything that you see here, you have reason to lose hope. But Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans for hope in the future." And so I'm going to try to end on a hopeful note amidst a very complex and very much of a bummer situation. It's just not it's not very hopeful over there right now. But we'll talk about all those things together. Okay, this of course is Nineveh. Our story starts here in Nineveh. Nineveh is famous for a number of reasons. Nineveh is the place Jonah was sent to. He disobeyed God several times, but eventually made his way there. Nineveh was the ancient capital of the Assyrians. The Assyrians are an ancient, proud, and noble race. They are first mentioned, or the city of Ashur, the highest deity in Assyrian theology before their conversion to Christianity, is in Genesis 2:14, marking where the Garden of Eden is. You don't get much older than that. Nineveh is the place where Sennacherib built it into its glorious state that you see there. And Sennacherib was the son, of course, of Sargon II. Why do I mention these things? Sargon II is the one who invaded Israel in 721 BC and destroyed and deported the 10 lost tribes of Israel. I'm going to bring those guys back into the story later on. Sennacherib is the one who laid siege to Jerusalem and it did not fall. 2 Kings 19. And the king is Hezekiah, and Hezekiah comes before the Lord in praise, and according to the Bible, 185,000 Assyrians were smit. They were smited, as the King James Version says, but they died. The Assyrian records show a different story. They don't mention the loss of life, but both stories agree that Jerusalem did not fall to Sennacherib. So Nineveh is an important place. Why do I start there? Because what is modern-day Nineveh? Mosul. In northern Iraq, on the Nineveh Plain, the Iraqi capital, the ISIS capital in Iraq. Everything's going to come back to Nineveh in one way or another. Now, before we get there, let's talk about our own country. If religion and politics have been a part of history since Sennacherib and his father Sargon II and the 10 lost tribes of Israel, how about our own history? That's a whole separate class, but in terms of our immediate national security context, and I used to work at the Pentagon for the Commandant of the Marine Corps, it was his own deity, of course. This is our context in the last 15 years. This is taken from the back of the John F. Kennedy. This is the ultimate symbol of American power. If you're in a crisis in the 20th century, the president asks, where are the carriers? That's changing a little bit with technology, but it's still true. 3 ironies to the attack on the World Trade Center, and you can see them in the background. This is taken July 4th, 2000, by the way. I was the guest of the Secretary of the Navy and his then executive assistant, Bob Work, who is now the #2 guy at the Pentagon. He's a dear friend and a former Marine as well. One is, we have been warned. They tried to knock down the towers in February of 1993, and we treated it as a legal issue. Well, it's a legal issue, but you know what? We're at war. And if people are trying to kill you, sometimes you've got to kill them before they kill you. But anytime you introduce hard power, you've got to do so with nuance, because hard power brings a whole ripple effect of unintended consequences. And you have to be very, very careful about the process. Here's the second irony. If the JFK had been in the harbor on September 11th, we couldn't have stopped the attack. So our security has to be about something more than hard power, which is to say, in academic speak, there's soft power. How do we think about soft power? How do we use that? And then there's one more irony.
Chris, do you have your phone in your jacket pocket?
You know what? I think I do.
Could you give that to Alyssa? I
No.
suspect that's causing the feedback.
Yeah. Maybe just turn it off. The third irony is this. We were attacked from the bottom up. We were attacked by non-state actors. And they were motivated by religion. And if you, like Paul and some other folks in this room, have suffered through any kind of graduate work on international relations, you know that religion is dead. Nobody takes religion seriously. How could that be a catalyst? And this was the American mindset. And our response over the last 15 years, unfortunately, has been mainly hard power. I'm not against hard power. I'm the fourth of 8 Marines and 2 generations of Seiples. We care about our flag, but we also care about not being stupid. And our approach for the last 15 years is somewhat natural. If you were a historian from 20 years later from now, looking back, you would say it's natural that the Americans responded this way with gates, guns, and guards, right? It's this physical response. But what about the spiritual response? What about the soft power response of trying to incorporate and engage the best of other faith traditions that are different from our own? Is that even possible? Or are they all the bad guy? Is Islam the new communism? We need a boogeyman in America. I don't know if you know that. We like to be defined against instead of trying to figure out and wrestle about what we're for. And that's the thing that I've been trying to work through for the last 15 years at our organization, the Institute for Global Engagement. Now, in our own country, we're seeing some changes. The military, as usual, is leading the way. Thinking about religion, I got asked to come in and brief. This is General Dempsey, the chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, before the present guy, General Dunford, who was a Marine. So I lowered myself and talked to an Army guy for a little while. But the point is this, the general sought out expertise on how to think about these things. Good on him. That's what leaders should do. How do you listen? I spent 90 minutes with the most senior guy in our military talking about religion and realpolitik and soft power. That's a rather amazing statement about who he is as a leader. I also spent 90 minutes with his think tank talking about these things. Now, if you didn't think that was amazing enough, you know who's been really leading the innovation here? I'm going to scare some of you. It's the State Department. The State Department is not known for innovation. And secondly, the State Department, and I have many friends there, my dad worked there. Please take this tongue in cheek. But the State Department is also, in many ways, the last bastion of secular fundamentalism, which is its own religion. You know, we can't talk about God because if we talk about God, then somehow we're violating the Constitution. It's that bad in some places, as opposed to, I don't care what your feelings are about the First Amendment, I care about engaging the world as it is. You know, if they say they're motivated by their faith, we need to think about that. We need to talk about it. Now, Secretary Clinton started something that is unprecedented in diplomatic history. She organized a federal advisory committee to gain what civil society thought about certain issues to inform and inform foreign policy. Yes, is this a photo op? You better believe it. Doesn't matter what party. But on the other hand, she organized legally a process through which civil society leaders, faith leaders, could speak into issues of gender, faith, etc., labor. And somehow, I was chosen to be the co-chair of the Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group. There's our little slide. We've met together for a year. And if you want more proof that there's a God, working with the 100 people associated with this Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group is like the Star Wars, the first Star Wars, where you walk into the bar. Yeah. That landscape of political and theological difference, it can't get wider. All faith and none, atheists don't agree on anything, right? But we agreed on this. We've got to engage the world as it is, and we've got to find a way to do religious engagement, how to think about these things. So what came out of that was a white paper that recommended that the State Department create an office to do religious engagement, not religious freedom, which is the office that my dad stood up, but to engage faith communities around the world on all issues, from environment to security to relief and development. That office was implemented within a year of our white paper. More proof. The State Department has never moved that fast. And Sean Casey, who you see there, was the first advisor, and it's now called the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. And if you know code for Washington, D.C., it's on the 7th floor. That means they have access and are blessed by the Secretary. If you have a 7th floor office at the State Department, that means you've got access. And now you have 34 people working for them to think about the role of religion in foreign policy. That's amazing. And I hope it survives the transition. Whoever wins the next election, this is the kind of thing that we need. We need to be thinking about the soft power issues related to our security. There's also a strategy that resulted, which you can see there, and it's on the website, that was organized according to our working group. And our working group has 3 subgroups: religion, religious freedom and democracy and stability, conflict prevention, and relief and development. How does faith speak into those 3 broad buckets? So there's a strategy. Are we doing anything with the strategy? That's another thing. But for once, Americans tried to think this through strategically as a society, speaking from the bottom up into the top down of the State Department about what it means to be an American, what we represent overseas. That's cool. That's cool. Now, the reality is, switching over to the Middle East here, overseas is a tough place to be, and this office isn't going to solve everything. This map, this data set from Pew for 2010 shows how Christianity, in particular, has fallen in the last 100 years. It's gone from 10% of the region down to 4%. The office has not done anything about this. Maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't, but I'm a fan of Voltaire, that great theologian. He said if you have one religion, you're going to have an authoritarian, totalitarian regime. If you have 2 religions, you're going to have a civil war. If you have 30 religions, you're going to have peace. Christians in the Middle East, Christians in the cradle of Christianity is not only the right thing to do, it's in our self-interest. There's more instability the less Christians there are. So we need to think about it from both angles. The spiritual and the geopolitical, and on the geopolitical, the hard and the soft. And of course, this office that has been created has not done a whole lot here. I'm not going to get into political commentary about leadership of this administration or lack thereof, but suffice it to say that ISIS is a hard nut to crack. And they've been around for a while, and they're going to be around for a while. So we've got to think about this and take a step back and go, okay, if we're in a multi-generational war, we need to start thinking about what does success look like? How do we engage? How do we understand things? What do we want the world to look like at the end of this century? When was the last time you heard a presidential candidate ask that question? What does it look like? How are we received? How do we help the global common good? So, being the educated Marine that I am, and that's not an oxymoron, hopefully, you take a step back, and I'm not a Middle East expert guy, okay? I'm a Mr. Magoo that's been thrown into this and feels called by God for this season of my life. And I took a step back and said, well, let's think about this. What is the history of Christianity there? How do Christians understand themselves? And what you see here is the number of churches that were there through the first 1,000 years of Christianity. Now, we don't think about it that way, right? We have cartographic camouflage. We see the Middle East and all we see is Muslim. And sometimes all we see is Muslim equals bad. That's not the right way to think about this, by the way. The church has a 1,000-year history in the Middle East. The descendants of the church in the Middle East are still there. And they want to stay there. Just as an example, this is the patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the East. You're going to meet his spiritual descendant later in this presentation, Timothy. He met with the caliph, the third caliph of the time, in Baghdad and had a mutually respectful dialogue about the differences, eternal differences, between Christianity and Islam. Different model. 781. If you were to ask the people in the church back then about Rome, that little city over on the western part of civilization? No. If you were a betting person then, you would have bet on the Church of the East. That's the Church of the East. It goes all the way to China. 781, same year that Timothy is talking to the Caliph Mahdi. Well, that's hard to see. That's what they call a stele, S-T-E-L-E. It's a stone monument. It's inscripted with Chinese. the Chinese translation of Assyrian words, because Assyrian missionaries had reached Xi'an, the ancient capital of China, in the central of China, and this talks about the luminous religion, the religion of light. And it was accepted as a part of Chinese society because Assyrian missionaries said, we are going to spread the faith by feet, not by force. That was their motto. That's the Church of the East. I didn't know any of that until 18 months ago when I took my first trip. I'm still learning. And if you don't believe me, there's every reason not to maybe, read this book. Philip Jenkins is the best historian of religious history in the world as far as I'm concerned. All of it's right there, and you can think about what the Church of the East is versus the Church of the West. Now, what about the immediate context, though? Okay, that's some interesting background, but what does that mean to me? What does that mean to the Christians who live there? How does that inform how I engage? This is Sister Maria, sitting to my right in the picture. For me, she's the story of the last 100 years. She's from the Dominican Order of Sisters, and they are originally from Caracoche. Caracoche is a small Christian village of 50,000 folks to the east of Mosul, east of Nineveh. And when ISIS came, they all fled on August 7th, 2014. Now, here's the important part about this story. Sister Maria was discipled by a woman by the name of Sister Catherine. Sister Catherine was with 5 of her Dominican sisters in Turkey in 1915. And Sister Catherine watched her 5 sisters get slaughtered by Turks who were Muslim. And she had her belly slashed open and was left to die. She survived by God's grace and discipled Sister Maria. You have 100 years of history in that woman right there that talk about the repeated genocides against the Christians. These Christians fled on August 7th. August 7th in Assyrian history and Christian history in the last century is known as the Day of the Martyrs. Because on August 7th, 1933, Muslims who happened to be Kurd and Arab massacred somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 at a town called Seiple. This is near Dohuk. Nobody will take responsibility for the massacre. And you can see that it's marked with a TV transmitter tower. An insult to these martyrs and what they stood for. So we go and we lay down wreaths to remember the martyrs and say that this will not be forgotten. And then we have to take the wreaths back. August 7th, 1933, Day of the Martyrs. August 7th, 2014, you flee Caracoche within hours. Every village on the Nineveh plain is fleeing ISIS because they were not protected by the Iraqi army or the Kurdish Peshmerga. And they flee into Kurdistan. That's hard to see, but this is my image of the church in the East right now. That literally is a small building of the Church of the East in a village about an hour north of Dohuk. And if you had to bet the future's not bright, you're betting on the dark clouds. But if you believe in the God of history, there's a little bit of hope. But people got to show up. People got to choose God back. People got to be obedient. People got to say, not what would Jesus do, but what is he doing? And how can I come alongside? Keep my mouth shut and listen. So what do you do with all that? My theology, we work in China, Vietnam, Myanmar. I can tell you all kinds of stories about all those places. But my theology of trying to do this for the last 15 years is this: show up and shut up. Listen. Take the time to listen to those who live there, who know their history. Understand them as they understand themselves. Don't come with the answers. We're Americans. We're fire, aim, ready. Ready, aim, fire is the way to engage this place. You spend a lot of time listening. You meet a lot of refugees. They could be my kids. They could be my kids. They're all middle income, high income families. They all fled in the middle of the night with nothing but the shirts on their back. Nobody defended them. And they see the same thing that happened in 1933, that happened in 1915, that happened before and before. And when you meet people, you also realize there's a whole story here. Mine is a kingdom theology. Mark mentioned Imago Dei, the image of God. I believe God's glorified when people had the freedom to choose Him freely, even if they don't choose Him as I understand Him. And I'm not a moderate Christian. I believe there's one way to heaven. I'm just not mad about it. But you have to appreciate other people's experiences because they are made by God. This is a Muslim man who fought with the U.S., lost an eye fighting with the American coalition against Islamist terrorists. He said he'd give his other eye to fight again with the Americans. The Muslims have suffered the most. You need to remember that. The Muslims have suffered the most at the hands of ISIS, Sunni Muslims and Shia, statistically speaking. Now, it's also true, and you have to hold these things in tension, it's also true that many Sunni Arabs betrayed their Christian and Yazidi neighbors, and they welcomed ISIS in. Sometimes because of the theology, but most times because they were tired of Sunnis getting killed by Shia, run by Baghdad, associated with Tehran. It's not all spiritual. And there's a lot of Ba'athist opportunists that wanted to bring their torture capabilities back to play. Muslims have suffered the most. The Yazidis have suffered the worst. Yazidis are not people of book. According to the Muslims, there are 35 and counting mass grave sites. Completely wiped out. There's only 600,000 of them in the world. 480,000 were on Sinjar, and they all fled into Kurdistan. All around Dahuk now. So you listen from the bottom up to get a sense, but then you've got to listen from the top down. You've got to meet with the players in the region. These are the patriarchs of the church. There's the Church of the East eventually splits into 4 or 5 things, as we Christians are very good at doing. Denominational splits, especially as a Protestant. This is the Syriac Catholic. This is Mar Yunan, the Patriarch Jonah of the Syriac Catholics. And that's Bishop Mushi. Bishop Mushi's from Mosul. This denomination is particularly under threat because they don't have a diaspora like the Chaldeans do around the world. They were almost entirely centered on the Nineveh Plain. You start taking them out, their denomination's gone forever. Chaldeans arguably could survive, not these folks. You meet with the leaders. This is the Minister of Interior of Kurdistan. He's been around the longest. He's how everything kind of works. But then you get to this very practical policy question. This is Sarah. I met her in December of 2014. She's 95 years old. She's living in the upstairs of the Assyrian Youth Center in Erbil, and she's living with 6 different families in a space that's no bigger than this stage. And she says, I never thought I would be here. I want to be in my home. She died in March of last year, a year ago. And the question becomes, as a policy person, someone who's practical, how do I get her back to her home, which is only 30 miles away? That's how close they are to ISIS. And now, because there's no hope, they're leaving and they're taking this dangerous road and paying folks, and women are using their bodies to pay for their families to get through Turkey, to get to Greece, to be met in Europe, sometimes with open arms. That's not the answer. I don't refuse the right of anybody to flee, but the answer is to keep them home. So, what have we done? We've developed a strategy. We call it rescue, restore, and return. Rescue means you're going to engage and help people get to the next day. This is a Yazidi camp. It's relief and development. If you engage anywhere in this part of the world, you're going to encounter broken paradigms. Relief and development alone does not work. Reconciliation alone does not work. The church alone does not work. Realpolitik alone does not work. You've got to bring them all together. And there aren't a whole lot of people thinking this way. How do you get them to the next day? Restore. There's a lot of broken people who've been traumatized. This is a woman in Ankawa Mall, which has now been evacuated out to better places. This is in the first days of the crisis. Alone, despondent. The longer families are together, the more tension results. They're living in very small spaces. It's just terrible, terrible living. The things that they've seen, some of these kids do drawings of seeing people beheaded. And another person from ISIS smiling as it's done. You got to engage trauma. Who's ever thought about trauma as relief and development, let alone security? If you have traumatized people who are not whole on the inside, there's no way they can go home. They got to begin whole again inside so they can be peacemakers when they go back when ISIS is defeated. Because the only thing worse than defeating ISIS is defeating ISIS without a plan in the aftermath. You're only going to get the zombie son of ISIS if you don't have a soft power plan about how to use faith. This is Yazda. This is the room where they interview and do their Yazidi organization. They document what was done. If you've ever seen the Shoah films, I used to live in Poland, in Krakow, near Oswiecim, Auschwitz. They bring the Yazidis in and they interview them. What was life like before? You have to know what life was like before in order to understand how much has been perverted by the genocide. And then to document the atrocities and hold people accountable like Radovan Karadzic in the Balkans. That's a part of the restore. And our last thing, rescue, restore, return. This is a view from the seminary in Al-Qash. I love this view because you're looking due south. You want to know what the Nineveh plain looks like? It's right there. 10 miles as the crow flies to ISIS lines. 20 miles to Mosul itself. As a Christian, every time I'm here, I think the gates of hell have not prevailed. But you can't stay in the mountains. You got to go back to the place where you're from and be salt and light and build peace again. How does that happen? How do you move from Al-Qash over to Mosul? This guy on my left there is Peter. He's on the board of Assyrian Aid. His mom fled the genocide in Turkey, and she found refuge in Al-Qash. And now he's back. This is about a year ago. But you got to get back to Mosul. So we're working with the Kurdish government. This is the Kurdish foreign minister. I've met with him 5 times over the last year. A relationship has developed. We're going to do a conference on coexistence, stability, and reconciliation. A Sunni Muslim has insisted that we talk about forgiveness and inclusion. The Kurds have been gassed and genocide committed against them by Saddam and Sunni Arabs. And they want to talk about this. April 12th, Microsoft Building, 901 K Street. We'll be there. If you want to come, let me know. And we think about things like safe havens. And could the Christians defend themselves? This is actually an Assyrian Christian unit on the Nineveh plain, training to defend itself because they don't trust the Kurds or the Arabs. They begged us to give them money to buy weapons because the only weapons they were given was not by the Kurdish government and not by the government in Baghdad. Remember, Kurdistan is still a part of Iraq. It was 100 AK-47s they bought off the black market. What kind of message does that send to Christians who were not defended in the first place? Paul told me to be hopeful, so we're going to conclude now with some hopeful stories. This is Sadak. He is a Shia Turkmen. I was in Dohuk one time, and I gave part of the rescue phase, gave him a food packet, and I went toward the center, the Sennacherib Sports Center, by the way. And by the time I got to the basement, he had used the food, he and his wife had used the food that I had given him to prepare a meal and invited me into his corner of the basement. He is a Shia Turkmen. When ISIS came, flights were made available for free by the Shias in the south to get out of northern Iraq. He stayed because he's a teacher. He wants to honor his students. His students are all Yazidi. There's hope that this good Shia Muslim who wants to honor his Yazidi students wanted to remain. These are the things you hold on to when you have nothing left to hope for. In El Kosh, I didn't know about this until this trip. In El Kosh, which is a very Christian village where that monastery was, there is a synagogue. And the synagogue, they say, predates the time of Christ. And if you, this lower left picture is supposed to be the tomb of Sarah, the prophet Nahum's sister. I don't know, right? But the synagogue is there, and you know who's protecting the synagogue? The church. The church is protecting the synagogue. No one's protecting the Christians, but the Christians are protecting the sacred space. Now, it's also true that there is a sub-tribe up there called the Magi. And so one story is that the Magi that came to see the birth of Jesus came from the 10 lost tribes that had been deported back to the Assyrian homeland by Sargon II in 721 BC. It makes sense to me. Now, what if this is the tomb of Jonah, blown up by ISIS in Mosul, in Nineveh, on June 24th, 2014. ISIS doesn't believe in iconography or shrines of any kind, and the tomb of Jonah had become a shrine for many Muslims. That's why they blew it up. Jonah is revered by the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians. Yom Kippur, you read Jonah. Chapter 10 of the Quran is about Jonah. Christians, we know about Jonah. Jonah is the only guy that Jesus compares himself to, actually. What if, when they blew it up, I think I got another slide here. It's hard to tell, but just take my word for it. This is my understanding of things. When they blew up the mosque, the church that it was built on saw daylight for the first time in centuries. And beneath the church, of course, was a palace of Sennacherib. What if Jews and Muslims and Christians united around, having built trust together in Kurdistan, and after ISIS is defeated, came back and built the tomb of Jonah together, and built a synagogue and a mosque and a church together? You're not watering down your faith. You're honoring the other person who's made in the image of God, and you're uniting around something that you have in common. Jonah. That's my multi-faith statement, but I want to end on a Christian note because this is what drives me. This guy, Jonah. Jonah Amitai. Translated means dove, son of truth. He's from Nazareth, a village right next to Nazareth. Spends 3 days in the belly of the whale and comes up from the land of the dead after he confesses his sins. You believe in the God of history, you believe the book of Jonah is foreshadowing Christ. It's just that simple. And Jesus makes the comparison himself in 2 of the Gospels. Do you think these Assyrians want to leave? They want to stay in their land. This guy's name is Rayon, and he snuck back into ISIS-occupied land so he could put up the cross that ISIS took down. The God of history works through individual people who choose him back. Not in some crazy grand vision way, but in a daily, mundane, miraculous way that sometimes involves risk. God doesn't promise you safety, he promises you security. And they want back because they want to stay. Why is that? Why is it that a guy named Seiple, a former jarhead, shallow evangelical, has with his wife, his fifth child, after not being able to have children for 7 years, has a fifth child 3 weeks before his first visit to northern Iraq? Our third boy. We always wanted to name our son Jonah, but the first two we decided not to. His name is Jonah. Why does that happen that way? And by the way, he lives up to his namesake. We call him Jonah Jailbreak. He's able to flip out of his crib, and you see him disobeying over there, falling asleep on the floor. Why is it that the Chinese church calls me up, we work in China, and says, we want to help the church in Iraq? You're looking at two Chinese pastors. They coordinated the response, the church response, the house church, the underground Protestant house church response to the earthquake in Chengdu in 2008. Just like what our churches did with Katrina, that's what they did in China. And the government let them because the need was so great. They've been praying. The Chinese know how to pray. The Chinese know something about persecution. And they came and we had a chance to meet with Mar Georges III. This is the spiritual descendant of Timothy, the patriarch from 781, who met with the Caliph Mahdi to talk about why his faith was irreconcilably different than the Muslim faith, but with respect, and Timothy, who sent the missionaries to China in the first place. One of our Chinese friends is born in Xi'an and grew up near the steel. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? They called me and said, we want to go. I took them to Seiple. The persecuted Chinese church could do nothing but weep and pray over the massacre site of 1933. That was their only response. They stopped asking questions and started praying. Peace on this place, peace on this land. Could it be that the body of Christ is being called together, and if we choose to see fear and an enemy behind every bush, maybe there's an opportunity for faith to work and to see opportunity because the Holy Spirit's moving. Aslan is on the move. The king, he's not safe, but he's good. That's Mr. Beaver from Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And then we got back to Erbil on Easter, and we said, can we worship with the Assyrian church? And you know what they did? You know, the model of Jesus is to take the seat in the back row, right? We showed up a little late for whatever reason, and we were going to sit in that outer room beyond the, whatever that is, vestibule arch. They took us and they brought us forward and they put us behind the sacraments, behind the altar. And we worshiped with the Assyrian refugee church, the persecuted church. And the Chinese took communion from the Assyrian priests. I'm telling you, that was last Saturday night at midnight. That, for me, is the most meaningful thing I've ever experienced. So here's the last slide. And this may seem rather boring and mundane after all of that, but it comes back to the miraculous and the mundane. Here you have somebody, I think of myself as a part of the church, with the Chinese church, and we're asking a Sunni Kurd, what are the needs of this land? And those are the top 5 needs. And it rings true with my own experience, along with creating jobs. But you notice need number 1. They are thinking about the day after ISIS and the fact that they have to get along. How does that happen? Only people of good faith and good heart can set that example, and I think that Christians in particular have to lead the way, and that we Americans have an opportunity to speak into that as Christians lead the way in their own homeland, their ancient land, these beloved Assyrian brothers and sisters in Christ. For all those who suffer, all those made in the image of God. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Nick Barden with the John Jay Institute of Philadelphia. I was really interested in your discussion on sort of what happened with the tomb of Jonah and the iconoclasm that has been going on with ISIS. You also showed some pictures of Christians raising crosses at certain key sites. At the Institute, we actually had the opportunity to meet with Bishop Kwashi of the Church of Nigeria, the Anglican Church of Nigeria. And he talked about some of the challenges that they've been facing with Boko Haram down there. There's a sort of Islamic theology of presence that leads members of Boko Haram to build mosques with crescents higher than any of the other churches as a way of affirming that this territory belongs to Islam. And it seems, well, first of all, I'm not sure if that's going on with ISIS, if you could comment on that. But it seems like there's also a sense in which the iconoclasm that ISIS is engaging in is destroying a lot of these historic Christian presences. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about how to address the theology of place in the Reconstruction.
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me respond with my national security side, and then let me respond then with my allegedly spiritual side. We should make no mistake about naming the threat. ISIS is a global phenomenon that requires a multi-regional response, a mixture of hard and soft power that will vary locally from Nigeria to Central Asia and into China. It's that big. It's that influential. And the threat is real. That's not to say that Islam is the problem itself. Islam is certainly a part of the problem. You can't sugarcoat that one. But all religion is local. We would never say that a Pentecostal church across the street from an Episcopalian church was the same type of Christianity. And the same is true within Sunni Islam especially. There's multiple variations and all these kinds of things, and there's all kinds of scripture here, there, and everywhere. Good, bad, and ugly. But you have to engage it, and you have to work with the local actors, and in every situation there's always a local faith leader from the faith's presence or tradition's presence that want to work for peace. Now you can agree to disagree, hopefully agreeably, about the theology, but they're there. The problem comes when you have all the answers and say, well, you're this or that, and therefore I've got the answer and you need it, here I come. We do that as Americans sometimes. If you would want to think about the situation in Nigeria, I would talk to my friend Cardinal John Anayakin, who is the Catholic Cardinal of not Arusha, that's of Abuja. I got Tanzania and Nigeria mixed up there. They have been doing this, and they are a little leery about the Americans. They said, you know, you just designated, John said this to me one time, Cardinal John said this to me one time, he said, you Americans just designated Boko Haram a terrorist organization, which it is. But his response was this: does that mean your drones are coming? And he didn't mean drones in a positive way. He meant drones in the stereotypical way of wedding parties getting wiped out on the Afpak border. And we work there, and I've been with the Deobandi Pashtun there. And I know what that feels like. I'm not saying don't go get the bad guys, but always work locally. All politics is local, all religion is local. And if you don't figure out how to have a hard, soft power mix within those theological contexts, you're never going to make it. And then there comes the spiritual response, which is, so if you're a Christian, you're called to be an ambassador of reconciliation. What does that look like? Every time I go to the Middle East, I think about the movie The Mission. I don't know if you've ever seen that. 1986, Robert De Niro, but there's a clear 3 sets there, and Mark probably knows more about this than any of us. But there's Unjust War, the Portuguese. There's Just War with Robert De Niro, the former slave trader, defending the Spanish mission, Jesuit mission, and then there's the pacifism. I'm teaching a Bible study at our church in Warrenton on Revelation, and it calls the church to be patient and endure. The church grew the most before it was affiliated with the state in 312. How do we think about those things? These are not easy things to think about, but all I can say is this: know your theology, know your own faith at its deepest and richest best, enough about your neighbors to respect it, and then dig deep locally, show up and shut up. And if you're a Christian, ask not what would Jesus do, but what is he doing? Because he's at work there. And he's at work through people who are anointed, his followers, his church. And here's the other thing that we have to get used to as Christians in America. He's at work through those whom he appoints that are not his followers. Isaiah 45, Cyrus, though you do not know me, I will use you for my purpose. Back to the lost tribes, Cyrus is the reason that the Jews get to come back to the homeland. Ezra and Nehemiah, after the Babylonians defeat Sennacherib and sack Nineveh in 612, and after they get beat by the Medes. It's through that geopolitical balance and power struggle that the Jews come home. So Jesus is working through the anointed and the appointed in a local context, and if we come in with our big picture thinking, as smart as it may be, and try to apply it in blanket form, we will crush it and we will make it worse. Beyond that, no strong opinions.
Dr. Seiple, two things. First, you mentioned hard power and soft power. Well, the past 7.5, going on 8 years, I personally believe that it's hard power because we, as an administration and an extension, the country as a whole does not want to engage in what you're calling soft power, which is the involvement of religion and all the aspects around that, because they are, as far as I'm concerned, hell-bent on putting together an atheistic mindset around the country. I believe that. That is one of their pinnacles. And that's why on my second point is I'm very, very shocked, pleasantly shocked, but shocked that that office at the State Department was ever allowed to open. And now that Secretary Clinton is gone, I'm even more shocked that it's still there. So what do you think going forward is going to be the lifespan of that office? And then, on top of that, what kind of engagement from that office are you able to do on the Hill to try and drive policies that will affect our government's response with some of our, you want to call it, the coalition of the willing, if it even exists, you know, to get some of them to start thinking in the same light of this presentation that you just gave us?
No, it's a great question, and I think it potentially gives hope to our country to be not bipartisan but nonpartisan. And let me just illustrate that through some of this history. You know, my dad became the first ambassador for religious freedom under Bill Clinton because Clinton was going through the Monica Lewinsky affair. Bill Hybels was the spiritual advisor to Clinton. Bill Hybels was on the board of World Vision. My dad is a Vietnam War veteran with 300 combat missions and a Republican who was helping kids all over the world. You put that equation together, and they say, hey, you need to look good. Why don't you get a Republican? You'd be bipartisan, and then you hold off Congress, who's jamming this down your throat. Clinton and Albright didn't want the office. That's how it happened. Now that's just messy, classic Beltway politics. That's democracy, and I believe there's something of God's hand in it. Especially if he would use even a Seiple. Then the second piece is think about Bush's White House with the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. Everybody fought that. But that survived into this administration. Why? At the base level, because it works. It's needed. You have to allow faith communities to be a part of the discussion. I think the same thing will happen with this office, is that it will survive. And so in these offices, the Ambassador for Religious Freedom, the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, there's an opportunity for people of faith and goodwill across the political spectrum to come together and say, look, we agree to disagree on all the traditional issues. But we can agree that people's right to choose faith freely or no faith at all reflects the best of our moral point of departure. That's the best of America, as far as I'm concerned. It's the difference between Massachusetts, which was a soft theocracy, and Rhode Island. I lived in both states, so I can say this, and I'm still a Red Sox fan. But Roger Williams said, we're going to let everybody get their own fair shake. Did you ever wonder, did you lose sleep last night why there were no witch trials in Rhode Island? Why no Quakers were hung in Rhode Island? Because they related religious freedom to security. And they refused to have the majority culture dictate to the minority. That's the exceptionalism of America. It's not a function of being American, it's a function of humans trying to live out the best of Scripture. That's why I go back to Roger Williams and not the deist founders. They're good guys, don't get me wrong. But I need people who are willing to go back to their faith and their Scriptures and say, I'm going to love anyway. I'm going to love practically. I'm going to live it in my life. I'm going to institutionalize it in the 1663 Colonial Charter for Roger Williams, in the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, and this, and we're going to build our American identity around that, even as we agree to disagree on the political ramifications and ripple effects on other things. So it's an opportunity is what I'm saying, but it takes leadership. And I won't get into the commentary, but I'm not seeing a lot of leadership anywhere these days, and I'm concerned.
What kind of reaction are you getting, because it's State Department, from our international allies? Europe, very secular Europe.
Another great question. You know, I was asked this yesterday when I was at Fletcher. I went to the Fletcher School in Boston. I was up there, and I don't want to stereotype the person asking me, but he was trying to make, it was from somebody very left of center, which I'm not, and he was trying to pigeonhole me. I said, you know what the number one thing our foreign friends are looking for? Is they're looking for leadership. And it doesn't mean that you have to do it in a certain way or with hard power all the time, but they want to know where the Americans stand. Leadership begins with telling people where we stand. We're the 800-pound gorilla on the sofa. And if we don't decide what we're doing or where or how, agree or disagree, then it's hard for the rest of the international order to settle into place and operate according to their comparative advantage. And so that's what we need most. And if we say that faith is important and it needs to be integrated into the response, people will listen. People will listen, but nobody's saying anything. We don't even have a small trumpet blowing. We have no trumpet blowing.
All right, we have time for one more quick question. There's a gentleman back here who's been waiting a while, so.
Hi, Chris. My name is Drew Bowling. I
Hey,
work for
Drew.
Congressman Jeff Fortenberry.
Yeah.
We've spoken in the past. I'm the author with Congressman Fortenberry of the Genocide Resolution, which 2 weeks ago passed the House of Representatives in a vote of 393 to 0. 3 days later, Secretary of State John Kerry came out and adopted publicly this position as the posture of the United States government. It is the second time in the history of our country we've declared something to be a genocide while the genocide was still ongoing. This took a lot of pressure, put him in a box, but he ended up doing the courageous and responsible thing. The question now is, what next? And my question for you today is not necessarily what's next, but what is next for those of us who try to figure out the future with two different realities. On the one hand, we have the neoliberal Lockean American construct of freedom guaranteed by the Constitution, individual and universal human rights. And on the other hand, a Middle East settlement where peoples, communities, ancient faith traditions, whether they're Assyrian or Chaldean or Sabiya Mandan or Kakai or Yazidi, have multi-generational blood ties that sink into the very land itself, going back generations. How do you square these two efforts into a common purpose initiative to create perhaps a safe haven in the region, which would allow for the continued existence and flourishing of these peoples in their ancestral homelands? That's my question for you. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Drew. Drew's one of the good guys, by the way.
I was going to say, for those of you that think Congress never has any good people, I think that's an example we do have a few.
And by the way, his boss, Jeff Fortenberry, worked hand in glove with a Democrat, Anna Eshoo, who is the only Assyrian in Congress from the 18th District in California, which includes Stanford, my alma mater. And it's proof that good things can still be done, even though they disagree on some issues, they can agree on civilizational issues, right? This is about civilization. If we can't agree on genocide, my goodness gracious. So, I think you're right. We have to move forward, because the only thing worse than to declare genocide is then to do nothing, which that means the Genocide Declaration is the final and ultimate self-indictment of inaction. We named it, and then we did nothing. So, if you're really interested, there's an article that we just posted on our website. We have a journal as well on Faith International Affairs, and I lay out a longer version about what I'm about to say to you in 60 seconds. But I think that we can declare a safe haven on the Nineveh Plain while we simultaneously do other big strategic things. Those big strategic things are the Syrian peace process. We need a conference on international boundaries. We're about to hit the 100th anniversary of Seiple, May 16th. We need to redraw the map. The map's already been redrawn, by the way. Iraq and Syria have ceased to exist except in our minds. It doesn't exist. What do the new boundaries look like? How does that balance Iranian influence coming west through Baghdad, through Hezbollah and Assad? We've got to think this through very carefully. But here's the thing. We're not going to solve it overnight. So on the other third big thing is we need a regional security structure. We need a regional security structure where the different places can meet, different countries and different interests can meet regularly and talk about these things. Are we going to solve that in one administration or two administrations? No. But if you ask the question, what does success look like at the end of the century? It's a regional security structure, not unlike NATO, that helps economic integration and cohesion. But how do you get there? Well, let's start with a strategic, small but significant step and declare a safe haven on the Nineveh Plain, protect those who need protection, send a signal to ISIS that this will not stand, take back the land that they declared to be a part of the caliphate, and say, we're going to use that land that you use to legitimize your theology, and we're going to defend the people that you're committing genocide against. Talk about stick it in their eye. That's going to stick it in their eye, and it's going to stick it to the ISIS wannabes worldwide. You can't even defend Nineveh? We can do this. Now, I am no fan of this administration, as you might have been able to figure out by now. The only red line is that there are no red lines. But they drew a red line once. August of 2014, they drew a line around Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan. And every driver that takes me up to Dohuk shows me the bridge where ISIS was stopped with American airstrikes. The line was drawn. They don't take credit for it for whatever reason. And we maintain Kurdistan and Erbil as a safe haven. If people say you can't do a safe haven, say, look, we've been doing it. Kurdistan is a safe haven since the end of the first Gulf War. You did it again in August of 2014. We can defend a few Nineveh villages and say, try to touch that, just once. And then you just kill everybody who comes that way. The message will get across. Now, here's the other thing that we have to think about. Because I don't want to sound like geopolitical hard power and negate everything I just said, right? But this is the reality of a fallen world. When I was there last week or earlier this week, somebody said to me, and he was tired of Western visitors, he says, reconciliation is a Western concept. I said, look, I understand where you're coming from. You always got to try to listen, walk in other people's shoes and all that kind of stuff. But reconciliation is a Middle Eastern concept. It's called the cross. And if you're not a Christian, look at Cyrus. Look at the Cyrus cylinder from 2,500 years ago about religious freedom in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. We need to reclaim some of those narratives. Don't buy into this. They've been killing each other forever. There's a lot of times where they lived together. There was a time when the patriarch talked with the caliph and agreed to disagree. That's the narrative we have to recover. And we have to do so intentionally. Build the safe haven, allow for these bigger things to settle over the next 10, 25 years. Have an American force there. The only thing worse than going to war without a strategy is leaving a war without a strategy. And that's what we did in 2011. If we had just left 15 or 20,000 troops, I'm not saying American military is a panacea, but it's a deterrent. All these things come together in a Nineveh Plain safe haven that sends a signal to the Yazidis and the Christians and the Sunnis who were killed by ISIS. You stay here. And overnight, we can have the most integrated religious minority province in the entire Middle East. But we got to say we'll defend it because nobody trusts us anymore.